now is oh, no, they were recording it. Okay.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Nice. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to what we've been doing in this particular, the angle we've taken is more at the subnational level. So we are looking at landscape approaches, which also includes seascapes, but we use landscape approaches as an umbrella term to capture how a mosaic of ecosystems and a diversity of stakeholders who exist in a particular area. Which could be a landscape or a seascape, but it's easier to imagine this term landscape approaches because it's easy to communicate to different types of stakeholder groups what it is than to talk about the technical term we use is socio-ecological production landscapes and seascapes, or SEPLs in short, but that's still hard to visualize. Landscape approaches is just much more easier for people to visualize what it is and much more easier for us to communicate integrated approaches. So the idea is to leverage multiple governance arrangements across diverse socio-ecological priorities. So what we mean by this, essentially, to start off with what a socio-ecological system is, we are looking at social and ecological components as operating as a functional unit. So it's a functional unit that we're looking at, and that nature and society are not separate, that it is that we are interdependent systems, we work together as a functional system. Also, within a landscape, landscapes or seascapes, they are utilitarian spaces, which mean there is something either it's tangible or it's intangible, but there's some value that we derive from it, and that gives us a motivation to conserve, or to or for multiple things. So there are different kinds of utilities we derive, and that's something that we should completely acknowledge, whatever be, however we relate to it. So the relational values we attach could be completely instrumental in a way, like it's like, okay, I value this because I get food from this resource, and therefore I value it, but otherwise it's sacred to me, and that's again a relational value. Or it's a ceremonial space. It's not just sacred, but it's totemic. It's multiple things. No, there are various ways that we can relate, but there is some form of utility that we gain out of it in a very broad sense. And that needs to be acknowledged, and that because it can be tapped into, and different stakeholders derive different types of utilities from a particular landscape or seascape. Now, a landscape also includes it is basically an interconnected mosaic of ecosystems, and that includes different types of governance regimes and management systems in place. So we are looking at, let's say, all the way from ridge to reef or even beyond, but all of these are interconnected. They know no boundaries, really, the natural system. And it could be, depending on context, or whether it's natural or social context, depending on that, the governance regimes can vary. The kinds of customary norms that are in place can vary. So there is huge diversity, both arising from the human dimension and also from the ecological dimension. And that's, again, it can go across governance regimes, which means across different types of institutions that have it can go from a macro planning institution to something that's extremely micro at the local level. These landscapes, again, are multifunctional. So there are multiple uses and multiple benefits that we get from there, from natural functions that arise from the ecosystems, from biophysical functions, from the diversity of, say, resources, to various regulating functions, to multiple uses, to actually providing us with food, with areas for infrastructure development. It's multiple. So multiple multiple benefits that we can get out of this. So these are multifunctional spaces again. And within these landscapes are different types of actors, and these different types of actors can have different priorities. And because of these various priorities, it leads to consequences. Consequently, we have different types of uses that are attributed to these different ecosystems and resources. So how these ecosystems and resources are used, it depends completely on the worldviews and the values that are held by different actors, which inform their priorities. Again, whereas demographies exist, and this leads to changing values. And again, this has, so it's a dynamic, we're talking about dynamic and complex systems here. And this is also a changing dynamic. So what is necessary for us is to see, if we want to talk about equity, if we want to talk about sustainability, then we need to target what motivates and what would resonate with the different actors who have different priorities, and what is it that would resonate to each of them, so they would engage in practices that we think is aligned with sustainability. Again, as I've been saying from the beginning, this includes a landscape, includes all these ecosystems, and then there are different types of governance regimes, all the way from protected areas to completely managed landscapes and seascapes, or ecosystems and management systems. There are different choices that are made on the use of the landscape, on how, say, for instance, the different pathways and the different, if it's about cropping systems, there are different types of cropping systems that we can follow to get the same outcome, say about increased production. It could be through an agroecological system, or it could be through a completely monocropping pattern. The outcome is that if it's just about increasing production, right? So there are different ways, different pathways, and different choices that are made, informed by different priorities. And each of these pathways that are chosen will have different consequences and different trade-offs. And they get supported by policies, right? So whether it's subsidies, incentives, policy instruments, tax breaks, whatever it might be, these are choices, these support the choices that will be made. And therefore, whatever those choices are, whatever the consequences that arise, need to be, for us, in the context of achieving sustainability and equity, we need to ensure that this is aligned with those concepts, which again means it's a whole lot of understanding the context and communicating the information in an appropriate manner. So what were we trying to do here? We are trying to seek to live well with using the landscape and seascapes and the resources inside, using different knowledge systems, which means respecting the diversity of knowledge systems that are there, the diversity of resources that are there, and not privileging one over another without due process. So it is ensuring that we can bridge across knowledge systems, bridge across actor groups, bridge across resource access instruments, and also looking at how access to resources, such as whether it's technical resources, human resources, natural resources, or financial resources, it is available at appropriate scales in the way it is required. So what is required on the ground, it might, for a farmer, is very different from what is required, say, for an entrepreneur who is doing a value addition activity at a larger scale of organization. And that requirement, scale, fit for purpose, and scale appropriateness is something that is embedded. So we can't have the same scale or the same measures to ensure that across all of the stakeholder groups and across all of the scales at which different activities are conducted. And these resources and all of these efforts are not necessarily coming just from within the landscape, but there's a lot that comes in from outside, and what kind of partnerships need to be built in order to enable a right mix of partnerships, just strategic, which ensure that the trade-offs are, the adverse trade-offs are limited, is something that we need to be careful about when planning is done. So if we go in for something that is mindful of all of these characteristics, the chances or the likelihood that we will come up with plans and implementation plans that are much more aligned with sustainability principles are higher than going in for. So that basically means there is coherence and there is alignment from the top to the bottom, of a planning as infrastructure, right from, let's say, the national government to the provincial to the subnational governments, and also further down at the level of local institutions. There is an alignment. The thread that connects all of their activities is much more aligned. And so there can be more feedback loops that are much more active and much more dynamic that can be put in place. So this is in a sense what we are promoting through the activities we do. We host at UNU-IAS a network called the International Partnership for the Satoyama Initiative, IPSI in short. And this network has more than 300 members across governments, NGOs, academia, indigenous peoples organizations, private sector organizations, foundations, etc. But all of them connected by this, by the commitment to strengthen activities on the ground that are systemic in approach. So this is a concept that is embraced. I wouldn't say that it's very rosy and that everyone's doing this, but there is a commitment. And the more we talk about this, we are finding that people are also getting motivated. They understand that this needs to be put in place, especially, in a way, all the crises that we see around us is an opportunity for us to communicate better, because people understand the significance of putting in place adaptive management measures and to have more anticipatory planning in their processes. So what would help in uptake of this concept? Essentially, and this is from the partners that we have, this is what we've learned, is that we need to invest, and this is invest at multiple levels. We need to invest in awareness raising in a big way. And this is right from the policymakers to people, to a farmer, let's say. It's that entire grading. So it's not farmer, I'm talking about any primary producers on the ground. Awareness raising on the systemic, on the complexity of a socio-ecological system, of ensuring that we don't operate in silos, and what happens when we have a more integrated approach, and how that helps them to have to achieve their well-being priorities, and also furthermore, building on these well-being priorities, actually move towards socio-ecological resilience, which means that they may be impacted by surprises in a system, whether it's natural surprises or economic or policy surprises, but they can anticipate and try, the surprise is there. There might be a shock. The shock can lead to a setback, but then they don't, get totally devastated by that. They are able to get up and, look at how to overcome or move on from a particular situation that they are facing. So there are some tools that we use for this purpose, but awareness raising is primary, it's foundational, and that means investing in good communication. And of course, awareness raising linked to that is enhancing the understanding. So it's not just about being aware, but actually understanding what the issue is. So we have a lot of knowledge, but that doesn't mean that we understand all of that knowledge that is available. So there's a lot of evidence that is there. How do we communicate that to to people. So if we are talking about, okay, we need to go in for more nature-based solutions, that's not something that is going to fly. That's not something that is easily implementable as a concept. But when it's linked to, okay, you can use the resources that are out there, you can engage in less harmful practices, less polluting practices, something that enhances the health of the soil and the plant. That's something that can resonate, that people understand. We all understand what that means. And that's very, very, that's crucial too. But to do all of this, to actually engage in such practices, to be able to look for the kind of finances that is required, to be able to look for the kind of technical resources that is required, there is definitely a need to invest in capacity development, and to see how this can be done. Furthermore, there's a need to instill a sense of ownership. It's not a checklist that they are doing for somebody else. It's something that is important for our own self, like what is being done at these various levels within a landscape. And to instill that sense of ownership, everyone from the top to down or from bottom to up need to be equally aware, and they need to feel motivated and responsible for the actions that they are undertaking. And finally, I've been saying this again and again, to communicate in a way that it motivates action. Because if it doesn't motivate, all the communication we do, what we call the SEPA actions, communication, education, promoting awareness, all of that is just there. We've done it. But if it doesn't resonate with people, we'll never be able to get to what we are seeking to do. And if it does resonate, our job is really half done, we would say. So when we invest in all of this, it's essential that we focus on a couple of points, starting with first raising awareness on the connectivity between actors and ecosystems, on our actions and the various consequences they can have. So it's actually walking people through visualizing, through mapping what they have, the assets that they have, both in terms of social and ecological assets, and to look at the diversity that exists and how they're all interconnected. So the actions on one, what types of consequences can they have on the other? So essentially being able to do a trade-off analysis at their own levels at which they operate, to be able to identify direct and underlying drivers that bring about change, and with what happens when those activities are done. So again, looking at the trade-offs and the choices that are made, to ensure that the focus on outcomes is always maintained. So we are not stuck in just the tools. And that's what we often see. It's like we have great buzzwords and we get stuck in those buzzwords, like we say, okay, let's go for carbon neutral development, land degradation neutrality. All of that is easy. It's very punchy, but it doesn't say much about for what. If we get so stuck in that catchphrase, than actually looking at, okay, we do this towards what? Towards enhancing resilience in a particular context, and that resilience or well-being, whether it's about being able to have anticipatory adaptive management across economic priorities, across equity and the various kinds of relations that we have with nature and people and amongst people themselves, and of course on environmental and integrity. These are various components that are outcomes, like why are we doing this and what do we seek to achieve. To ensure that that focus is not lost is important, and all that we invest on we should remind ourselves whether we are focusing on these dimensions. And of course, to develop tools that can be customizable to context. So to not be prescriptive, but to provide tools that people can then customize to their own different socio-ecological contexts. And then the most underlying all of this, we can have great ideas, but we need, commensurate resources that can support the uptake, for at the scale and at the context that we are looking at. So securing the various resources, how do we enable actors to secure these resources, whether it's technical, financial, economic, policy, human resources, all of this needs to be factored in and thought through when we go for this for such an approach. And essentially, all of this is, we are nesting one within the other. It's across the whole planning and governance regimes that we are planning this. So I will stop here. We can take questions later from the audience, but this is an introductory, as I said, an introductory presentation. This is more about setting the scene about what a nested approach could look like, and yes, because we work a lot on landscape approaches, although which essentially is an integrated approach, and there are several such approaches with different nomenclature, but speaking to the same idea. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand over the floor to Patrick now. Patrick, if you could introduce yourself, your work, and then speak more to this topic, it'll be great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sunita. First, can you hear me? Well, very well. All right, let me fire up the presentation from my end, and I will dive into the discussion. Okay, so am I assuming, can you see my screen, colleagues?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. So, as a means of introduction, thank you so much, Sunita, first of all, for this opportunity to contribute to a topic that is really dear to my heart. Because, well, first of all, I'm Patrick Callas. I work with the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. I'm an environmental specialist and a political ecologist, and I currently oversee the implementation of two large-scale impact programs that are funded by the Global Environment Facility. One is on food systems land use and restoration, which is in 27 countries. And the second one, which is just starting, it's called Food Systems Integrated Program, and that is starting to be rolled out in 32 countries. So my perspective will be both conceptual, but then also highly operational, to ground our thinking into action. Because as Sunita said correctly, we need action at scale, and urgent action. So my presentation will be focusing on operationalizing this nested governance approach through, and I will introduce this, a multi-stakeholder transformative governance approach. Now, as Sunita mentioned, the words and the approaches are less important, but the thinking behind it. So I will unpack this in my presentation right now. So just briefly, what I will go through is a reality check, the relevance and the landscape. I'll look into integrated landscape management and land use planning, building on what Sunita has mentioned in terms of the settle. I will introduce this conceptual and operational framework. I will look at tenure, and then I will give some examples in countries where this is being applied, and I'll show some initial findings, and I will wrap up with some takeaways. So, well, first of all, Sunita already alluded to the fact that there is urgent action across different dimensions. From an environmental standpoint, we realize that we are not only pushing the planetary boundaries, but we're exceeding those in many ways. This is an example on climate, and this is an example on biodiversity, and there are others, right? That said, we also need to recognize that there are persistent and, quite frankly speaking, utterly unacceptable and shameful human development challenges that we are still in need to tackle in terms of food and nutrition security. And we also need to realize that it is not just an environmental challenge we have, but again, building on the first presentation, it needs to be a balanced approach between social and economic aspirations that people have. So just to give an indication here is that, of course, millions of fellow citizens rely on agriculture in this sense as a main source of income, but also as a way to sustain their food and nutrition security, while also clearly having a footprint, which is illustrated by the deforestation statistic here in Africa. That said, there are many opportunities and bright spots as well, and one of them is that in our context, in which I work, if we were to succeed to transform, agri-food systems, they hold many of the solutions to address some of these environmental challenges, but also human and socio-economic challenges. So what we are operating in is a paradigm of healthy planet and healthy people. And what's important here, this comes from the GEF, is that it's that concentric middle that we are tackling, which is by definition very challenging, and it's integrated and systemic. And today I will zoom in into the landscape, which we are focusing our discussion here today. And I will try to illustrate how we can make progress on that particular space, while recognizing that the landscape is not in an isolation, and I'll come to that. So building on the first presentation, and I will say this a lot because Sunita, you provided the perfect framework, I think, to frame us. I thought about what is a landscape, and at times it's a nebulous concept to explain. So to me, it is a mosaic puzzle piece of different elements that constitute different land uses, different motivations, different aspirations. And that puzzle piece, in fact, needs to be defined somehow to make it operational. So to us, in our context, we define it as a space that is geographically distinct, that's bigger than a single farm. So that's one. Secondly, it is defined, also politically, hydrologically, agroecologically, economically, but culturally. And there is more to that, also building on and bouncing off the concept of the SEPU. But the boundary is defined. And this is important. So again, overlap that these are socio-ecological systems in which we coexist and where different elements interplay. So the question then is, how do we plan or manage or govern, right, this space? And we know that there are challenges, that there are sectoral boundaries between agriculture, between environment, between other sectors. But there's also jurisdictional boundaries that don't necessarily match with the landscape. So there is a governance challenge per se. And in addition to that, we have different land users that all have their own legitimate aspirations and priorities, as we see here from the farmer to the investor to the conservationist, etc. So what I'm suggesting here is that we are in fact looking at a multi-stakeholder landscape governance challenge. It's a governance issue. It's not just a planning issue, but it's a governance issue, and that we need to unpack and understand to make progress. Now, I will be brief here. The entry point is integrated landscape management. And I just wanted to put these definitions up here. I'm not going to read them, but just to say that, any concept that we present needs to be also rooted in evidence and in consensus of understanding what that means. So in essence here, the takeaway is, again, the multiple objectives, right? It's not just agricultural production, but it's the provision of ecosystem services. And in fact, it's an interplay that needs to be managed and governed. Secondly, there's sometimes confusion between what's the difference between integrated land use planning and integrated landscape management. Yeah. So here again, some definitions to ground us, and I understand this presentation will be shared retrospectively. So I would invite you to dive into this a bit more deeply. But in essence, land use planning is the overarching, let's say, element which in each of our nations, usually at the national level, land use plans are being developed. And integrated landscape management, right? It's how that space then is managed is often embedded into this integrated land use planning processes. So we just need to be clear what this is, so we understand also how these interact and coexist. So integrated land use planning is often associated with territorial planning or spatial planning. But of course, integrated landscape management goes a bit further than that. And this is important again to see how this is nested in terms of the overall approach to how land, whether at the landscape or national level, is actually planned for and governed. So if we take all of this into consideration, a close friend and colleague and actually lead author, Louisa Janssen and I'm presenting this together with her. We really thought hard about, well, what does it take then to bring all these elements of governance, of multi-stakeholderism, and of transformative. We need to be transformative together. And this was unpacked in a concept which then we needed to look into also the elements of tenure and the governance of tenure. Because in our assessments, this came up as the number one challenge in terms of managing the landscape more productively and equitably. So rights-based approaches are actually fundamental in this concept of transformative governance. So if we see all of that, we can then put it together under the integrated landscape management umbrella. And we take the multi-stakeholder transformative governance conceptual framework, which unpacks governance, multi-stakeholder partnerships, being transformative, rights-based approaches, tenure rights, and tenure security, and operationalizes this within the concept of integrated landscape management. And moreover, this realization where to put the focus came from a stock-taking exercise of 150 publications, where precisely those elements that I've outlined came up as the top, let's say, challenges or barriers to better landscape management. So I'm going to accelerate a little bit to say that this was then applied very operationally. And how do we do that? So integrated landscape management, this is nothing new, has certain steps that are more or less universal on how do we plan and manage that landscape. So what we then did in the context and relevance of this discussion today is that we highlighted, well, where do we put the emphasis on this transformative governance? And these are the steps where we put that into the ILM circle and apply, I should say, in those two GEF financed impact programs, right? Because every one of those programs has an integrated landscape management or ILM component as a mandatory component to make progress. All right, so if we look at this framework, then the key now is on the baseline collection. We need to understand the point of departure, where we are. Now, again, this is nothing revolutionary or let's say exceptional, except that it's not being done systematically, right? And that's the whole point. That despite of this obvious observation, it is not done based on our analysis systematically across our development interventions. So the context, let me therefore bring you into the context now, how this was applied in 3 countries. So I invite you to travel to Kenya, Nigeria, and Vietnam, right? In Kenya, we work on coffee. These are landscapes of coffee production. In Nigeria, it's on cocoa and oil palm, and on Vietnam, it's on rice. And the reason why these commodities are targeted is because they have large environmental potential negative environmental impacts. Yeah. So in essence, the challenge of these programs is to make that production more sustainable, diversified, and in harmony with achieving global environmental benefits. So integrated landscape management is the entry point, which is used to come up with the final outcome. And I very much like that, Sunita. Let's keep that outcome in mind, which is in this case a deforestation-free commodity or crop value chain. Yeah. So in rolling out and supporting these countries, the conceptual and operational framework of multi-stakeholder transformative governance, including tenure, very important, was rolled out in a participatory way. Now, on participation, another obvious term, but I could not agree more, Sunita. This is it's beyond awareness, it's about common understanding, and it's about internalization. So initially, we may look at this elephant in our individual sense, but only through a inclusive process do we get a common understanding that we're actually looking at an elephant, right? So this is fundamental as a principle that anything we do should be by definition ingrained with this concept. And yet again, systematically speaking, it may not be done to the extent that we need it. So the project in itself is aiming to, or the projects rather, are aiming to improve on integrated landscape management. What they have not explicitly looked at is at the governance and the governance vision. How do we monitor whether better governance of the landscape is happening? So, and in addition to that, what is the specificity on tenure and land rights in that concept? So there's a picture from Nigeria, again, just highlighting the participatory nature and the visioning, that first we need to understand what is the current state of governance in terms of what is happening in terms of different institutional arrangements. Now, again, nothing new, but what's interesting here is that we're looking at formal and informal institutional settings to understand where we need to improve on the status quo. Okay, so what are some of these findings initially? Well, first of all, again, through this participatory process, we, and with we, I mean the land users themselves, right, are recognizing that there's fragmentation and coordination elements. Furthermore, there are gaps in tenure, which is quite striking, because if one wants to develop an integrated land use plan, how is that possible without understanding and addressing tenure? Yeah. In Nigeria, very interesting. What about the traditional authorities and customary rights? Right? How do we address that in a context where 95% of agricultural land is in fact untitled, and therefore limiting the investment and the incentive structure that also Sunita mentioned in terms of behavioral change and motivation to change things at scale. In Vietnam, interestingly, we then also found out that, again, there's coordination and integration issues, not only between sectors, but also across levels. So as we move from the national to the subnational to the regional to the local level, there are there's room to improve these processes, how coordination is happening, and how collaboration is improved or can be improved. All right. So as a way forward, I mean, clearly, if we are looking at transforming the landscapes, we need to look at elements around transformative governance and multi-stakeholder transformative governance. And the challenge that we have is that our institutions, and I would say some of our mindsets, generally speaking, are not yet fit for purpose in terms of dealing with integration in a manner to also adjust our thinking of more innovative and different approaches around governance. And this is something we can pick up maybe during the discussion. In our understanding, and building on the trade-off analysis that Sunita had mentioned, this is absolutely key and probably the most difficult part of addressing this. And we are working through this with the three countries in those landscapes because there will be winners and there will be initial losers, right? So how do we deal with that? And how do we compensate or deal with conflicts in a way that is, let's say, mutual acceptable to make progress? Very difficult. How do we deal with power and power imbalances or power relations? We look at that also as part of our governance analysis, and we can have a more in-depth discussion maybe following that the presentation. And then finally, I mean, how do we break silos, right? That are both internally and externally, which are done by definition of the way that the system has been set up in managing, let's say, a landscape. So we will continue progressing in those three countries. So we have two additional countries which are signing up, and then probably towards the end of this year, early next year, we will have results, lessons learned that will be shared across additional 24 countries, all as a global public good, and then feeding into the new cycle of GEF Food Systems Integrated Programming around 32 countries. So, final slide here. What are some of the key takeaways? Well, first of all, sustainable. Excuse me for the typo, transformation and policy coherence through nested governance starts with better managed and governed landscapes. And that's why we're spending so much energy on the landscapes. If we were to be able to govern those spaces better, we could make a huge difference. Secondly, as an introduction here, the multi-stakeholder transformative governance approach provides a conceptual but also practical guidance framework on how we can operationalize nested governance in practice. So it's an invitation to learn a bit more about that. And yeah, again, ownership. Ownership is absolutely critical. And we need to think very hard on how we actually foster and deepen ownership so it becomes a much more, let's say, equitable and equally harmonized discussion rather than an imposed solution. And we are trying to do this in the countries, but there's more work to be done here. Finally, here are the publications that underline some of the thinking around multi-stakeholder transformative governance, around tenure-scaping, meaning integrating tenure into the integrated landscape approach, and a most recent one which looks into some early lessons learned in the countries that I've just highlighted. And with that, I thank you for your attention. We'll share some additional resources here. Let me stop sharing. And I will give the floor over back to Sunita. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, that was such an exciting presentation. Actually, there's a lot in there. For me, yeah, the emphasis you make on rights-based approaches, and that includes tenure and all of that. It's so I was involved in the IPBES values assessment in the chapter that looked at policy options, and so we had to assess various policy methods and instruments, and what we found was the rights-based approaches. So it's a big category, right? The rights-based approaches actually had the most transformative potential than, yeah, compared to the other. So we did have criteria, and of course it's expert judgment, but we had criteria looking at how many types of values could get embedded and number of stakeholders. So it was a transformative potential was measured on certain criteria. We found rights-based approaches to have the most
Interesting.
potential, but the least used.
I see.
Yeah, of all of the economic instruments and legal instruments are the most used. But their potential for transformation was actually limited compared to what rights-based approaches could do. And also socio-cultural instruments would come next after rights-based, but rights-based is like really top. Yeah.
Thank you,
Okay.
Sunita. Yeah, just to react, that's reassuring, and happy to learn more and continue the conversation on that. Excellent. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Patrick. So again, Q&A we parked for later, and there's, I guess, I hope to have a lively discussion session later on. I'm going to hand over the floor to Bemi for your presentation, Bemi. Over to you. You can share your screen too.
Thank
and
you.
introduce yourself.
I can just introduce myself first, and then
Yes.
I'll launch
Yes.
in.
Yeah.
So my name's Bami. Thank you for having me today. I'm sitting in Los Angeles, so I have my coffee. And I'm actually here in place of a dear colleague of mine, Juan Ramos, at Eco-Agriculture Partners and 1,000 Landscapes for a Billion People. And so it's great to be here. And I formerly of EcoAg, I'm also with 1,000 Landscapes for a Billion People initiative, used to have a background in environmental planning and policy, with a focus on community engaged research, teaching and learning, particularly in sort of the integrated space that we've been talking about today. Used to be at UCLA, still working closely with UCLA folks, and the community and doing community engagement and social change work there, thinking about community engaged research methods, teaching and learning. And Patrick, I loved some of your framing in your presentation. I'll be teaching again in the fall, master students in sustainability. So I absolutely will be reaching out to you after this, because some of the way you frame this, putting on my teaching hat, was really powerful and useful and just generative for me. So I'd love to follow up after this, because I'll be teaching again soon, and it'd be great to talk to you more. So anyway, I'll go ahead and launch. I'll bring up my slides now. Let's make sure from a technical perspective they're working. Hold on. Okay. Okay. Can you all see this? Just a tech check. I'll share actually like that. Can you see?
Not yet. Yeah, now it's come on. Yeah.
It's thinking. Okay. So I think we've laid the groundwork for the session that we're at today. And I think that both, Sunitha and Patrick, you laid an excellent foundation for us. So some of this may be sort of bringing together or reaffirming, confirming what you all have shared already earlier. And so then if that's the case, I think that's great, because then I think there's already been really rich points of discussion that you all have talked about, that I think we can circle back to at the end and for the discussion time. So this is just to, again, reiterate, I think, and situate where we are, why we're here today, thinking about what does it mean to have coherent decision making? How can we support coherent, I would also add transparent decision making at local levels of implementation? And so what we've already talked about, again, this is just resituating us, is the nested nature of governance structures. And the fact that the way things are right now, because things are so siloed, partners aren't working cross-sectorally together. They're not coming together. We are lagging in many social and environmental goals. And these social and environmental goals and the challenges that we're facing, they're interleaved. You all have probably heard of the term sort of wicked challenges out there that talk about the interlinked and complex nature of the social and environmental challenges that we're facing. So there's a real need to mobilize and maintain, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, is you can bring together, one time some folks together, but how do you maintain this energy over time? How do you sustain it? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But across these scales of implementation, vertically and horizontally, and the challenge that underpins a lot of this, and hopefully we can talk about this a bit more in the end in terms of our experiences across us process, is this incoherence across the priorities, the incentive structures, and the different contexts and challenges that we're all facing. So we're needing to consider this incoherence in planning and implementation processes, which again situates the discussion today, but also all the thought that Patrick was discussing, the different frameworks in terms of integrated landscape management. And it was wonderful to see Dr. Shear cited there. She's a long-term mentor, colleague, and friend of mine, so it's great to see her there. But linking to all these different frameworks and thoughts and the way we're grappling with different governance structures, from ILM to the multi-stakeholder transformative governance, and how these things practically and conceptually can interplay and interact with each other. So thinking about, again, why we're here today, the solutions toward nested governance approaches for social ecological systems. And I jumped way ahead. Hold on one second. One second. What is it doing? Let me get out of this because it's doing something funny to my screen that I don't like. Oh, here it is. Okay, there we go. Okay, here we are. Sorry about that. Okay, tech recovery. So, oh no, I don't need to do that. Okay, so I'll just go into this slide because it's wanting to pull up drawing instead. So, sorry about that. I don't know why. There. Here's where I was. So we talked about social ecological systems, and then Sunitha, you talked about social ecological production landscapes as well, and sort of as the underlying theoretical framework here, but the landscape approaches, and including seascapes being an umbrella term. So I think you all have already spoke to this. I think we were all good at covering our bases. So you can see that, like, I also covered the theoretical framework that underlines our thinking. So hopefully people really have walked away with understanding this today. And I loved, oh my gosh, Patrick, I loved your puzzle drawing and animation as well. I think that was very sort of heuristically useful. So thank you for that. So anyway, again, to underscore, we're all coming in from the acknowledgement that social ecological systems are connected. We're trying to push back against the sort of conventional structure of siloed systems. And we recognize that social and environmental goals and challenges are interconnected. And a huge part of this is not neutral, right? I mean, I really appreciated we could talk about this more than not, to sort of power dynamics and acknowledging that, not pretending that those aren't here. So thinking about power dynamics, the rights-based approach, and then a critical sort of principal value characteristic of social ecological systems approach, again, being transformative, also being community-led and participatory. So this idea of community engaged learning, teaching, management, research, this is all very fascinating to me personally, and it's integral to this work. Again, thinking in this nested approach and across sectors vertically and horizontally. So, and already, Sunitha, you talked about how do you think about these trade-offs, and so thinking about managing trade-offs and what are opportunities to optimize synergies. Because the idea is if we get out of these silos, there could be opportunities for us to do better, for our work to be better, if we're getting out of these silos. So it's not just stopping damage, but actually going further and not just, for example, stopping the conversion of natural ecosystems, but going further and better and having more enhanced, more healthier ecosystems, both productive and natural, and the interconnections and interactions across these spaces. And then the idea being that if you have a social ecological systems approach, there's an opportunity to improve resilience, social ecological resilience. And by looking at connections between practice, pulling from practice theory here, but looking at connections between practice and outcomes, you can actually spur innovations where if you have more adaptive capacity, when there are, Sunitha, you mentioned sort of shocks and disturbances, rather than those shocks and disturbances creating more chaos, having a social ecological systems approach can actually spur innovation. And so that's a really exciting topic we could talk about more, but I think opportunity. So reasons for doing this, the opportunities for doing this to doing better, not just sort of prevent or stop or hold back existing sort of damages or consequences. And then something we've thought about a lot is how do you both embed the participatory community-led, this mobilization of cross-sectoral multiple stakeholders in an inclusive way in a place. And how do you maintain this over time? I've taught a community engagement and social change research capstone for years, and I would always tell the students who are working with partners doing real community engaged research projects, things will change 100%. Things will change. So you need, it's not maybe, it's not 50%. Absolutely, things are going to change. That has to be your starting assumption, whether it's the partners you're working with today versus tomorrow, political environment, natural disasters that will happen, even more so now with climate change. So things will change. So how do you maintain that energy mobilization in light of that? And so again, reinforces this need for nested governance structures that we've talked about today. And so how do you regenerate places? Again, go further. How do you be regenerative in these territories led by diverse local actors, considering power dynamics? And then think about, alignment. So how do you align with policy, planning, finance, management? And then think, while there are boundaries, I've been thinking a lot about the porous and fluid nature of boundaries and how that can access opportunities. I mean, there are challenges too across porous and fluid boundaries, and we could talk about that more later. But how can you, again, it being community-led, how can you access opportunities vertically and horizontally? And I think that's something I've been sort of chewing on lately, and we can talk about more, hopefully, in the discussion. And then so building on a lot of the work that Dr. Sarah Shear and others have been doing at both EcoAg and then 1,000 Landscapes for a Billion People. I think you mentioned this Patrick, this wheel in your work. And so this is sort of linking back to what you were talking about, the ILM wheel. And so you could see at the heart of it is the landscape partnerships. That's at the heart of it. And so what we found through EcoAg had convened for years, maybe you all were part of it, or you probably knew about Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature. That was the precursor to 1000L. So a lot of it in trying to do this nested governance approach, and doing it in an equitable way, there has been, and we've found this, there is an interest and demand for capacity strengthening. And what are the pathways look like? There's multiple pathways that for how you can do capacity strengthening that has impacts on the ground. And sorry, I should have mentioned before, my role in 1000L is to co-lead the capacity strengthening design team. And so specifically related to this sort of need and how do you do it in a way that's actually leading to meaningful impact. And what we found is, and you'll see it on the 1000L website, that's great. There's many modules and resources out there, but this becomes really powerful, the capacity strengthening, when you actually scaffold it and you model integration, an integrative approach when you're trying to do capacity strengthening of integration, of ILM, of nested governance. And so community of practices are really powerful, and they're most powerful if you're able to link what communities, partners are learning with application. And then peer-to-peer learning. But when you're able to have communities of practice, peer-to-peer learning, acceleration, seed, catalytic grants, those sorts of things, and then mentorship while folks are applying what they've learned, it can become really powerful. And there's examples out of EcoAg, 1000L, that are doing this kind of work, such as, for example, with the International Model Forest Network work, and particularly the Latin American Model Forest Network. And in doing this, not having the capacity strengthening being top down. In the case of a lot of landscape partnerships, these are folks who, there's different levels of maturity, and I'll get into that in the next slide in terms of how long people have been working together and their experience. But in almost all cases, people are coming with extensive knowledge of their place. There's multiple types of knowledge, and bring innovative, really useful experience to bear that helps them in their context and can help others as well. So then this leads to, okay, but when you iterate learning and application and thinking in light of the integrated landscape management wheel or process, and I should maybe take a moment to say, you see the 5 elements here where landscape partnership is the heart of it. And then you have shared understanding, which is, and then vision and planning, taking action, and learning the impact. And this isn't linear. Folks, depending on the maturity of a landscape partnership or alliance, they may be starting at different places. They may start in a place, go back. This is very iterative and linear, and should be adaptive all the time. But in doing this process, there needs to be it needs to be contextualized, as was discussed earlier. And Sunitha, you mentioned that in the beginning. So this needs to be contextualized and connected to vertical and horizontal planning and policy processes. So, looking at the shared understanding. Oh, sorry about that. Looking at the shared understanding element of this, of which, if you go into more detail in the 1000 Landscapes sort of body of work, you'll see that there's many multiple outputs across all of these 5 elements, that in each of their own, there can be a great deal of training. And then there's also foundational pieces of this, like considering diversity, equity, and inclusion. So looking at shared understanding for a second, doing work like context analysis and understanding sort of the place, the economic, governance, environmental, social context of a place, of a landscape or seascape, and doing this in mapping, and doing both of those things, both the context analysis, mapping, having them be done in a participatory way, is really important, both relationally and building the sort of the foundation that we work together. Thinking about landscape action planning, again, connecting to policy and finance levers, and then having MEL, or monitoring, evaluation, and learning, being integral across the process, and then also to being outcomes oriented and having those links to planning, policy, and finance. And we can go into this more a little bit later as well. Okay, so now I'll briefly go into some of the cases and examples across 1000 Landscapes for a billion people. And to say that, and share some of our experiences, that there are there's typically entry points, or an entry point that can lead to bringing multiple cross-sectoral and multiple partners together to do this kind of work. In our experience, there may be a thing that is not an entry point, and then from there you start to get into more the integrated landscape management, and sort of this integrated approach, or landscapes approach, let's say. So often, and this was discussed earlier, is through agriculture and food systems. And we've been doing a lot of work with, I don't know if you all have heard of Region 10, but doing some work, and we could talk about that more later, but doing some work with them, thinking about transforming food systems transforming food systems, and thinking at both the farm and landscape scales. And 1000L did some work on that. And there's a report here, and I could share the link, about transforming food systems through regenerative landscapes. But again, and they're doing some great outcomes framework work as well. And again, thinking across scales has been key to that. Another entry point is watershed management. Water is often an entry point for bringing folks together to start to think about this. Extractive land uses. So for example, artisanal and small scale gold mining can be a reason to think about how are land uses impacting communities, the vulnerable, and the ecosystem. So it will bring folks together to think about how to think about that, and oftentimes then thinking at a broader landscape scale invariably comes up as important to do when you're talking about something like extractive land uses. And so some of my colleagues like Juan and Seth, they work on landscape finance, and often finance itself, mobilizing resources in a place. And the key learning we have is when you talk about integrating landscape management, so finance can be an entry point that brings folks together, but you can't get very far in landscape finance without thinking about the management part, or some of those components of the wheel that I referred to earlier, without thinking about the core part of landscape partnerships, without thinking about how you identify and map and in the long term engage and have this be ultimately community led, right? And so finance can be an entry point, but again, you don't get very far if you don't think about these other things, and vice versa. You can't get very far in planning, and governance without thinking about the finance piece. So finance has been an interesting entry point, but we find that it's all the more important than you then model integration of the integrated landscape management and finance, both. They shouldn't be siloed. Also, another entry point that can bring folks together is risk management. So sitting in LA, we had a very scary start to the year with fires here, not far from where I actually am sitting. And so
I'm going to have to ask you to quickly summarize, because we have only another 4 minutes left to wrap up the
okay,
session.
I'll be very quick. This is actually the last slide, so we're good. Okay, so fires can be another entry point. Forest management. Another thing that I nodded to earlier was the maturity of efforts, and how, again, this is not a linear process. In thinking of like ICL and land scales work, whether it's partners coming together or they've been working together for a while. On the right side of this slide here, you'll see both resources and some effort. So it's been a pleasure, Sunitha, to be working with you on this effort for costing, this effort we're working on to cost landscape approaches. How much do these things cost that can then inform those who are trying to do this, can inform governance and the planning and the policy processes, and inform decision makers, inform folks who are trying to finance this work. We need to know how much it costs. So that's a project that we're starting on. We could talk about in a second more. The Region 10 paper, looking at across scales, farm and landscape scales for regenerative landscapes, that paper's there. And then some work that Juan has been doing in the Alto Mayo landscape on a finance strategy. That link is there too. I assume these links will be shared later, Sunitha, hopefully. If not, any way I can help with that, I'd be very happy to make sure these resources are shareable. And then here's your discussion questions. I put them here at the last slide, straight into segue. And then here's an example from the Region 10 work that we can, just to show sort of how things are connected, but we don't have to go into it now unless that's a question.
Yeah, I mean, so we have another 5 minutes that we could go over, is what they say, which is good. But then let's cut down instead of 2 challenges. And no, I think we can collapse some of the questions and get started. Maybe. But first, Bemi, thanks. That was such a brilliant presentation. Sorry, I didn't acknowledge that.
It was. I was not last minute, but I was
Oh no,
I'm sorry,
yeah, but you did a remarkable job, and there's just a rich, it's such rich experience that we have out there. And I think it's also kind of like a responsibility how we bring this, and the point that Patrick was making earlier, like it's not sufficient. Like it's there, nothing's new, but it's not being taken up as much as it should be, and we don't see the visibility. Maybe if we could have a very quick round of discussion looking at what we would think is the biggest constraining factor. I think if we could identify what we think from our own experience, what is 1 or 2 biggest constraining factors? that see, going into something like this, like a nested approach, an integrated approach.
Mhm. Do you want to start, Patrick, or or it's up to you?
Go ahead, Bemi. I can come in afterwards,
Okay.
please.
Okay. I think that in reflecting recently, I think the positive thing is I think that some of the language that is out there now, people are using the word landscape approaches, or something similar. I think the language is there, and that is a positive thing, and that's progress. I don't know if we had this language, folks had this language 50, 20 years when Sarah, Dr. Scheer was, sort of working with colleagues on this work. I think that now that you see in all these different places, this language being used is remarkable. The constraint still, though, is I think people are struggling with the how of it. And I think, and I really appreciated, Patrick, you brought up examples and more examples and learnings in some way that's distilling this so that people have a clear sense of the how. And perhaps a working theory, if that the practice of this, which yes, we need to be outcomes oriented, but the how of it, the practice of this was more, that's where I think we need to make progress on, while at the same time trying to realign incentive structure so that you're not going against the grain so much.
Yeah. I'll over to you, Patrick, and then I'll come in a little bit with some
Excellent.
incentive-based stuff that we did later.
Excellent, Bemi. Just very briefly, I think power. The word power, and we need to be more explicit about it, understand institutional political economy elements. We are progressing, but we're at the nascent stage, right? The other thing I would say is evidence. Do we have evidence that as a result of integrated landscape management, a landscape is more sustainably managed? Do we have that? Maybe yes, maybe no. Do we have evidence on SEPL, SES, ILM, MSTG? Yeah. To me, and linked to that final point, how do we track progress in terms of indicators and success, right? On the metrics of things. And there we could collaborate together, I think, of bringing all of these concepts and thinking together and coming up with practical operational frameworks, hopefully based on evidence that could guide policymakers then, right, to put systems in place and convince policymakers that yes, if we go with integrated landscape management, we will have better development outcomes. So let me stop here.
Thanks, Patrick. So I was just going to, I had actually noted down power and evidence. I didn't say evidence as such, but there's some research that we did looking at the impact of subsidies and incentives at the level of SEPLs. Okay, and there this came out so clearly because it's power, but it's when they say what constrains them in achieving what they want to achieve, like at the local level, they are in competition, not with, so it's like the drivers are not like infrastructure projects, are the incentives going for infrastructure projects having an impact. That's not the big thing. They're in competition with the big players in their same sector. So it's with commercial farmers, for instance. Because the kind of support that's given there, it's just humongous. It's a totally different privileging that goes on. And what they came up with was interesting. They were like, okay, there's no radical reform, but they say, okay, you give support for chemical fertilizers. If I want to use a different set of fertilizers, give me the same type of incentives, just make it equal, give me the same set of subsidies, or raise the subsidy, remove the same subsidies that you give them, make it the playing field the same for the inputs. I need energy. I'm often off the power grid. So what I'm looking for is to have incentives or support to be able to have my own renewable energy mechanism, like a small setup that will help me to run a dryer, for instance, So it's value addition, it's embedded, health, everything is embedded. But what's required at that scale is so unique, right? And access to the resource is not easy because they have to constantly negotiate with the planners. And planners don't realize this because this level of, that means you actually have to sit and listen to what is the requirement. And that's not happening at the pace and scale. There are, like you said, Patrick, there are bright spots, but it's still just bright spots, like it's how, and I think a bigger question for us is how, because we all have patches of evidence, right? And is there a way that we can start pooling? Because it's more becoming like a meta partnership kind of a thing that we can start pooling.
Looks like
we have to end. Okay, we should take this.
Need to meet.
No,
Okay,
but
I loved it.
we will engineer this. So Patrick, as Bemi mentioned, there's this costing exercise we're doing, and if you would be interested, I will send you the details.
Yep.
And then we could maybe think of having a meeting later on.
Yeah,
let's do this.
I'll be in touch
I didn't see any questions in Q&A, and we had another participant who left. But I think anyway, thank you to Akuns for giving us this opportunity to air our thoughts. And yes, the presentations. If you could send me your presentations, then I could convert them. If you can convert them as PDF and send, then we can maybe put that on our website or something.
Okay. Perfect.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you, Patrick, and
thank you.
Nice to see you as always.
Thank you, Sunita, Bemi, and we'll be in touch. Yeah, wonderful.
Yes, I would like that.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.